A very good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Ananta Center, I'm pleased to welcome you all on today's discussion. For today's discussion on economic trends and transformations, a post-budget review. The discussion will be moderated by Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, Editorial Director, Business Standard. Today's speakers are Professor Pinaki Chakrabarti, Visiting Distinguished Professor, NIPFP, and Professor Prachi Mishra, Professor of Economics at Ashoka University. Thank you all for joining us. With this, over to you, Mr. Bhattacharya.
Thank you. Very good afternoon to everybody here. And I must also thank our panelists, key speakers. The subject is economic trends and transformation, but it is happening 10 days after the presentation of India's annual budget for 2025-26. As we all know that in government, at least in the Indian government, the budget is increasingly becoming important, not necessarily because it has got the annual financial numbers for the government, but it has also become a bit like a kind of the State of the Union address by India's finance minister, which does not necessarily cover only the fiscal numbers and everything, but it also gives you an idea of what's really the government's approach on various economic, at times social, even political issues. Even, for example, the year ago there was a budget, there was a reference to of the one country, one election issue. Now, so that's the context in which India's budgets are prepared. So we are going to discuss economic trends and transformation based on that budget document. Briefly, before I invite Prachi and then Pinaki to sort of say a few words, maybe 10 minutes each, on how they perceive this budget impacting or impinging on economic trends and transformation of India. I just want you to sort of, create the context of sorts, And the context is briefly that if you're done, then can you just move aside? Yeah. The context is that this is a budget that, in my view, and my speakers are free to disagree with me, is a budget that shifts gear. We have seen budgets in post-COVID where budgets have, by and large, relied on reviving the economy through investments. But this is probably the first budget in the post-COVID era where it is not just talking about investment growth, but it's also added the consumption boost through supposedly a tax cut for the middle classes. Now, there's a lot of debate about who is this middle class. Is it really the middle class or the rich? Is 12 lakh the exemption is the right thing or wrong thing? I'm sure our speakers will throw light on, shed light on. But it's clearly a shifting of gear. That's number one. Number two, as I said, that it's a kind of an economic gamble, that whether it will really be able to achieve that consumption boost, that's the desired thing or not, something that we are all waiting to see. Number three is that this budget also ushers in my assessment, an era where you continue to follow the basic principles of fiscal consolidation and a little bit of transparency as well. Okay, why little bit? Quite a bit of transparency. I mean, whatever the budget is doing it out in the open, unlike in the past many years, where you don't even know that what numbers are actually trying to hide. So this is a transparent budget trying to follow a fiscal consolidation path. And now you have got a new trajectory on which is going to be debt anchored. There is also a very important element in this budget on what should be the government's trade policy stance, particularly with regard to tariffs. There is an attempt at reducing a lot of tariffs, not just the applied tariff, which is the effective tariff, but also what is called the tariff. So that is also being done. How far, how deep it has been done is something that time will tell, and we will see. The fourth thing that this budget does is it is trying to overhaul an income tax regime which is waiting to be revamped, and the new income tax law will be available to all of us, which I think will simplify, reduce litigation, make it simpler, quite apart from the fact that what the budget did itself in terms of tax exemption. And finally, I think the budget clearly signals from its overall financial allocation a retreat of sorts from two areas, one good and one not good. One is a retreat from the kind of public sector policies that this government had committed itself in 2021. So there is a kind of a retreat from there. Even though the post-COVID problems are over, I think privatization or disinvestment are not really looked at. That is one retreat. The second retreat is early signs where industrial policy, which was seen through the productivity-linked incentive scheme, the PLIs, where the government decides who's going to be the winner of sorts, that whether you come and apply for it, you invest in a project. 14 sectors were identified. The government in this budget clearly showing signs that the PLI approach is probably not going to be extended beyond a certain point in time. At least after 5 years, most probably it will see its sunset. What's more important is some of the demands for more PLI schemes, which were made to expand from 14 to 18, some sectors like toys, drones, and etc. Nothing of that sort has happened. As a matter of fact, the budget has a major focus on the toy industry, but not through the PLI scheme. So I do see that the retreat, one good and one bad, retreat from the PLI, I think is a good thing, but retreat from disinvestment and privatization is not a good thing. And finally, before I ask Prachi to speak, is an initiative on green energy is something that you feel good about, in the sense that there is a long-term vision that has been outlined. And as I was saying, that the budget is a statement of policy intentions also. And this nuclear energy plan, the small modular reactor approach to creating more nuclear power using the US civilian nuclear deal is a good initiative. It will take probably India's climate transition strategy a few steps forward. With these words, I will now invite Prachi to say how she looks at the budget from economic trends and transformation point of view. Prachi.
Thank you, AKB, and thank you, Indrani, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to come to this beautiful campus, and also witness this beautiful room, and have a discussion here. So thank you very much. Sorry. So I will speak on the budget mostly from a macroeconomic perspective, which is my area of expertise. So as I read the budget, I have 4 key takeaways. Number one, I think we have to recognize that there has been an unwavering focus on macroeconomic stability. And as AKB mentioned, this is evident in continued commitment to fiscal consolidation. So over the last 4 years or so, central government fiscal deficit has declined by almost 2 percentage points of GDP. So from like close to 7% to close to 5%, more precisely from 6.8 to 4.8% of GDP. So this is, very impressive and clearly, indicates that there is a strong commitment to fiscal consolidation and therefore to macroeconomic stability. If you look at the fiscal year 2025, which is April 1, 2024 to March 31st, 2025, there's also been, if you look at the revised estimates, there's been an overperformance of about, fiscal overperformance of about 0.1 percentage points. It's mainly due to reduced capital expenditures, and we can talk about it. Going forward, the budget envisages another 0.4 percentage points of fiscal consolidation, so going from 4.8% of GDP to 4.4% of GDP. So I think this really has been continuing over the last several years, that trying to preserve macroeconomic stability through continued commitment to fiscal consolidation. So this is number one. Number two is the focus of the budget on growth. I think this comes against the backdrop of slowing growth momentum. How do we economists measure growth momentum? We look at something called seasonally adjusted annualized rate of real GDP. That has slowed from about 8% last year to 4%. This is a measure of, this is quarter on quarter change, rather than looking at year on year change from, particular month this year compared to the same month last year. If you look at quarter on quarter changes, you get a sense of, how much is the momentum in the economy. And that momentum has indeed been slowing, as I said, from 8% last year to 4% now. And I think this has really been on top of mind of the economic policymakers who are crafting the budget. So I think this has been addressed through two ways. One, which AKB talked about, it's very evident, raising the thresholds for income tax. So now, previously, if you were 7 lakhs or below, you did not pay tax. Now it's 12 lakhs. Of course, it works through a rebate, etc., but these are details. And this is really in line with, if you think about the former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, his vision was empowering the individual means empowering the nation. So it's definitely in that spirit. Second is more nuanced, I think. In fact, if you look at the details in the budget, and as you know, the devil is always in the details, there's increased fiscal space for capital expenditures. And you might be surprised, because I think most of the narrative is that, this budget basically means that the capex has, hit a ceiling, etc. So where will growth come from? But if you actually look at the numbers, the consolidation in fiscal deficit, the 0.4 percentage point, is almost entirely driven by efficient management on the revenue account. So basically, revenue expenditure is contracting, and that explains almost the entire consolidation of fiscal deficit. And this revenue account management or revenue account contraction comes from just three items. So one is administrative costs, second is central government programs, and third is other expenses. And think about, what are administrative costs? Basically, it includes fixed expenses like salaries, pensions, office expenses. These were really growing faster than GDP over the last several years. So there has been a contraction in, what is envisaged in the FY26 budget is a contraction by about 5% in this revenue expenditure, driven by these three categories, which are really day-to-day operational expenditures, looks like very inefficient. And on the other hand, if you look at, capex, capital expenditure, that if you take into account what is called how much is given to the states to spend, which is called, capital grants, or that comes under revenue expenditure. If you actually count it in capex, and again, it's a more technical point, but effective capital expenditure is growing by 17%. So basically, to those saying that, government capex has hit the ceiling, this budget is actually not doing that. It's actually freeing up space for, it's creating fiscal space for capital expenditures going forward if you really focus on some of the details. So these are the two key takeaways. First is, as I said, continued focus on macroeconomic stability. Second is the focus on growth. And this is all good news. However, this brings me to my third point. That is, despite all these consolidation efforts, fiscal challenges still remain for the sovereign. And this probably goes beyond the budget, but if you look at India's sovereign debt situation, it's about sovereign debt, if you include center and states, it's about running close to 84% of GDP. And this is, what this means is that, when you have high stock of debt, your interest payments are very high. So India makes a big chunk of the revenues it collects actually goes in making interest payments, which means that you don't have enough space to spend on health, education, and other developmental activities. So I think this is a constant challenge. This is not new, but I think this is a continued challenge. So despite consolidation efforts, this big fiscal challenge remains. And, we care about it because, of course, high interest payments crowd out space, for development activities like health, education, but also, rating agencies care about sovereign debt. And you'll often hear the argument that, look, we don't believe in the model, in the models of rating agencies. They have, they include, for example, per capita income as is a big determinant of their ratings, etc. And that is all fair. I think, we don't have good understanding on how rating agencies decide their ratings. But the fact remains that, ratings remain an important driver of foreign investment flows, which countries in developing, countries in the development phase need. And it's also an important predictor of ability to repay. So foreign investment flows are correlated with higher ratings, and sovereign debt is an important ingredient of these sovereign rating models. So I think this is a constant challenge, a constant fiscal challenge for the sovereign, and therefore for foreign investment flows, and more generally for expenditure on developmental activities. So this is my third takeaway. That is, despite the focus on macroeconomic stability, despite continued fiscal consolidation and focus on growth, the big fact is, stylized fact is that India's sovereign debt remains high. And if you look at, we are making a big chunk of our revenues we collect is actually spent in interest payments, which crowds out other important spending, and it also affects our sovereign ratings. Finally, let me conclude by saying that, what does it all mean for growth? Again, there are, as AKB rightly pointed out, I think there are growth, we are raising the thresholds for income tax. There is, if you look at the details of the budget, there is, space created for capex. But ultimately, for a macroeconomist, what matters is the overall fiscal impulse in the budget. And if there is fiscal consolidation in the budget, this implies that there's a drag on growth, at least from a cyclical perspective. So overall, I think big picture, if there is consolidation, that definitely has, from a simple macroeconomic perspective, it means a negative fiscal impulse. And that is going to continue to be a drag on growth going forward, at least from a cyclical, short-term fluctuation perspective. So to summarize, I think it's not easy. I think the trade-off between growth and macroeconomic stability will always be there, and it is very hard. Balancing the two is like, walking on a tightrope. And the budget really points to steps in the right direction as it walks on this tightrope. I think the success of any budget really depends on the government's ability to execute. For example, what its planned capital expenditure is, about 17% growth in capital expenditure, while at the same time trying to maintain its support for labor-intensive sectors and for the vulnerable population. So the way I read the budget is it puts down a pragmatic framework, and it tries to maintain a balance between fiscal prudence and growth, and how we actually see the economy evolving forward, or the path ahead will really require careful navigation of both domestic and global economic challenges. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Prachi. If difficult to summarize the lovely presentation that you made, but you said it's pragmatic, it's balanced, there is fiscal consolidation, there is a growth impulse, and yet you do point out on fiscal challenges and also whether the managing this growth will be, will have its own challenges. So I think what you sort of said, what they say is what you gave in one hand, you little bit took away with your other hand. So it's a balanced budget. So Pinaki, with these words, can I ask you to, if you want to add to our understanding of the budget, so what would you say?
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Thank you, Indrani, for the invitation. And thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. Thank you, Prachi, for a very, very important perspective on budget. What I would like to do here is not really talk about budget numbers, but since it is about economic trends and economic performance, I would highlight a couple of issues that I think is emerging as a fiscal, path for the country as you look at budget of last couple of years. And also try to talk about this, emphasis in the budget speech about next generation reforms for higher growth, greater deregulation, and also climate. And then I'll talk about a bit on this issue of fiscal consolidation and also, about the income tax, because that's something very significant and everybody is talking about it. So let me start with the fiscal consolidation versus fiscal expansion. I think there has been this discussion about income tax limit that has been increased, resulted in significant fiscal expansion, and the number that is in media is around 1 lakh crore. And the other argument is critics are saying that this 1 lakh crore should have been spent, lower end of the distribution of income would have got more money, that would have had a greater positive effect on consumption compared to giving income tax bonanza to the middle class. So I was just looking at WDI database, World Development Indicator database, and if we look at in India, it's around 44%. I'll just have to take my other speaks, the reading one. So I think it is about 44% of the total income is held by 20% of the population. And in that context, if we really talk about, this income tax distribution that has been enhanced, I think it is going to impact positively help the lower end of the distribution of that income tax payment. So that's one set of issues. And then there is this set of issues about expenditure being given, those who do not pay income tax at all, so they don't come in the income tax. So one side, you certainly have to make a balance about how much taxes a person who pays tax should pay, and what is the expenditure relations, that what is the kind of expenditure stimulus you would give. I think this needs to be separated. I think there is certainly trade-off, but the trade-offs are not one-to-one. So in that context, I think a balanced view is necessary. And as far as expenditure is concerned, I think fiscal consolidation of 4.4% of GDP, which is, I think, the terminal year of Finance Commission, it is supposed to be 4.5%. So that way it is on target. And one of the reasons is that expenditure has not really increased as a percentage of GDP. It actually shows a marginal decline as a percentage of GDP. So that's the first point when you talk about fiscal contraction versus fiscal expansion. Now, what does this indicate? Now, I think gone are those days where, middle class used to feel happy if the railway fare has not increased, or the monthly bus ticket hasn't been increased. Of course, bus ticket was not decided by the central government, but railway fare was. So if we really are talking about, distribution and push fiscal expansion for the people who pay income tax, I think the instruments that is there in the hands of the government is very limited now. You have to do it through the tax side only. So I think this is going to happen, and going to happen more as we move forward. This has happened because of growth, technological changes, mean income going up. All these factors have played a role. So this is not something unusual. So 97, the income tax rate was reduced to 30%. Now after 25 years, if the income tax limit has increased to 12 lakh crore, I think 12 lakh rupees. I think this is part of the prosperity that you see in India. You really cannot give in-kind transfers to the middle class in terms of lower bus fare or lower railway ticket transfers, etc. So I think the nature of economy has changed. So kind of fiscal expansion that you see will be more and more through the taxes side. That is driven by economy. I think that process is going to continue. Second issue that I wanted to talk about is the issue of second generation reforms that we are talking about. Most of the second generation reform that we are talking about, I think these reforms are primarily at the state level, whether it is land, whether it is climate, whether it is better regulation of power sectors, or anything that we talk about. I think the reform, if we are talking about growing at 8-9%, I think individual state level reform will be very, very, very critical. I think center's reform and the big bang push it has given to growth, I think the scope of it is now limited to taxes. Expenditure side, I think most of the things have been transferred to the states in terms of, not transferred, I would not say transfer, most of the things are at the state level, because states also spend more money compared to center when it comes to total redistributive expenditure as well as capital expenditure. So from that point of view, I think that the focus of reform will be at the state level, and if that focus of reform will have to be at the state level, I think center's announcement of second generation reform, which fall in the domain of states, would also require greater consultation with the state. So and India has its own successful example of informal consultation becoming a formal constitutional body like GST Council, was the import committee of VAT, because VAT reform was something which was very informal, where all the state ministers were together, decided to introduce VAT, then ultimately it became GST. So if we are talking about reform in land, reforming stamp duty and registration, reforming power sector for better finances, to improve their discom finances, I think these reforms require consultation between the union and states. And I think if really we want to take this reform forward, I think a consultation framework to start with at an informal level is very, 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 very important. And that has to be initiated by the union government, because individual states will not do. And that has to happen if we really think about growth engines will be the state. Center can only be an enabler. Now I'll move to the issue of uncertainty, fiscal prudence, and macroeconomic stability. I think if we talk about uncertainty, fiscal prudence, and macroeconomic stability, three issues become very important. I think IMF data on debt, global debt, shows that globally the household debt is increasing. India, though the household debt is not very high, I think still household debt is increasing after COVID. So there is a stress at the household level. Now, we see a peculiar situation globally, including in India, where household debt is increasing, indicating stress at the household level, but there is significant fiscal consolidation. So in other words, we see a fiscal contraction when probably the need for fiscal expansion has not been completely, is still there. So there is a need for fiscal expansion, but at a global level, and in India also that is true, because we see large scale reduction in fiscal deficit, large reduction in debt after COVID, which was necessary. But I think we need to take a balanced view when we talk about talk about the stress at the stress at the household level. I think personal debt has increased, unsecured loans have increased, household debt is increasing, savings rate has come down. I think these are signs of macro stress, and there I think a balanced view of what should be the level of transfer, what should be the level of subsidies, and what should be the level of fiscal consolidation. I think that requires a balanced view. I think it is always, now all the transfers have been branded as freebies, and we have been talking about transfers to households are all bad. I think there's a kind of view that has emerged that it is going to destroy state and union finances. I think more balanced, more nuanced view on that is absolutely necessary. I'm not saying that we should have fiscally profligate spending, but I think more balanced view on what is necessary in the critical context of rising debt at the household level needs to be considered. Finally, on the question of debt at the union and state level, I think both states and the union government have reduced their debt sharply after COVID. I think it was around 92-93% of GDP. Now it is around 83-84% of GDP. And now, and if we look at the composition of this debt, I think two issues become very important. One is that India's debt is largely internal debt. So we borrow from our own people and finance government budget at both at the union and the state level. So the risk is less. But I think if we look at the composition of this debt in terms of the volume, 65% of the debt is at the union level. So 30% is at the, 35% is at the state level. So if we really want to bring down this to a level which is, I would say it is still manageable, but I think it will become less stressful in terms of interest outgo. I think the center's debt has to reduce at a faster rate. Why do I say that? I think one is the volume of debt of the center is higher than that of the states in aggregate. Secondly, constitutionally, most of the redistributive spendings are at the state level. So if most of the redistributive spendings is at the state level, and if we try to engage in excessive contraction at the state level, that can also have an redistributive implication. So centers' primary job is macroeconomic stability, not much on redistribution. So I think that consideration is very important when you talk about fiscal consolidation for the medium term. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pinaki, for giving us a different perspective on the budget. You focused on reforms. You focused on how tax giveaways probably have come to stay. You also talked about how uncertainties on the debt management issue can pose a real challenge. Now, let me ask you. Let me start with you. You talked about how the next level of reform will have to be at the state level. Now, obviously, the union budget is probably not the forum, but if you'll remember that last year's budget did talk about a national economic policy framework in consultation with the states on factor market reforms. Now, is that what you are suggesting, that there should be need for reforms and deregulation in consultation with the states? And I mean, is your vision? I mean, the budget should have talked a little more about such deregulation, particularly because the economic survey talked about the deregulation stimulus. So, what's your sense of that?
No, I was. If we are talking about reform, let's take the example of land. I think if we are talking about land reform will not move an inch if we actually don't do it
at the state level.
We don't take the states on board. So what I'm saying is that these reforms are absolutely critical, has to be done, and that, but center cannot do it. So if the state has to do it, I think that consultation has to happen with the states. maybe an incentive framework. I understand there is this capital, interest-free capital loans that was given to the states had some of these reforms inbuilt into it. I think that is one way to push reform, where you actually ensure some money flows because of certain kind of reform. But if we are talking about broad-based reform like GST, which has happened, that cannot be done through fiscal incentive in terms of more transfers to the states. I think this requires a wider consultation. So from that point of view, I think center and state should regularly discuss some of these factor market reforms and come out with a framework. For example, if we talk about JNURM wanted the stamp duty registration rate should be 4% because that would make the property market more formal. But this hasn't happened because in many states, stamp duty rates are above 9-10%. So I think the factor market reforms and reforms of the real estate, land market, everything requires states approval.
You think the
Unless
states
we do that, this is not going to move forward.
Okay, and you will include local judicial reforms also to be part of that same thing?
It's very difficult for the center or state government to do judicial reforms.
But somebody can take the initiative with the local level courts, which create a lot of problems in the ease of doing business at the MSME level. I mean, should that also come under the framework of the committee that you're talking about?
No, I'm not talking about a committee, but I think there should be some framework where these issues are discussed. But I also feel that all the issues cannot come to this committee. So if we are talking about reforming land, so how do you do that? Let there be a discussion. I think that is what is very important. The factor market means it's a vector of things, right? So that way, I think we need individual. I think consultations for each factor. So it's not one committee deciding all the issues.
Okay. Let me come to Prachi. You talked about the debt framework. You talked about fiscal consolidation, but you also raised some issues which are fairly challenging in the sense that you do believe, and rightly, that 85% of combined sovereign debt is not an area of comfort. If you have seen in the budget does talk about different scenarios, growth scenarios linked to what should be the debt reduction. Therefore, following from that would be the fiscal deficit figure. Now, is that easily implementable even at the central level? And how do you propose, as an economist, to take states on board? Your thoughts?
Yeah, AKB, I think, when we think about debt or sovereign debt, it's debt to GDP. So this ratio can reduce by either reducing the numerator, which is debt, or by increasing the denominator, which is GDP. How do you reduce the numerator? I think it's, fiscal consolidation is the way to reduce debt. I think it's very the trade-offs can get very biting, especially in an economy which is slowing. So how much do you consolidate? Because if you consolidate, think about fiscal consolidation. What is fiscal consolidation? You are either increasing taxes or you're cutting expenditures. And if you're cutting expenditures, these may be pro-growth expenditures. So it's not, so there is, you have to strike the fine balance of how much you're consolidating. Can you consolidate more? But that's, you would rather not if it slows your growth more, especially in an economy, in an economic cycle in which we are, where growth momentum, as I said, is already slowing. So I think the other way to reduce this ratio is to increase the denominator. And the denominator can be increased in two ways. One is real growth, and the other is because the denominator is nominal GDP or through inflation. I think, again, reducing, inflating the debt away is not the most, most desired, especially from a macroeconomic perspective. So real growth, I think growing out of debt, I think is perhaps the most, in my view, the most sensible strategy at this point, given that we are already consolidating. And, that is already, that has, as Pinaki said, that has reduced debt. We were above 92%, during COVID. So bottom line, I think, growing out of debt, I think, would be a win-win strategy, number one. And number two, absolutely, I think getting the states on board is extremely important. But as Pinaki said, states are anyway, majority of the debt, 65%, is by the central government. So if you grow out of debt, I think then it's basically not center or states. The country as a whole has to grow, and that would free space for capex. That would be growth enhancing.
Does it mean what you're suggesting is growth is an important driver here?
I think at this part of the cycle,
Yeah.
I think growing out of debt is a better strategy than further consolidating than what we're already doing.
So do you think that this budget has done enough on that score?
See, I think that's that's where the catch-22
Uh-huh.
position is, because I think to the extent you have consolidation in the budget, from a macroeconomic perspective, the impulse is still negative.
Uh-huh.
So while you can say in a granular way that you've given incomes in the hand of people, or you've freed space for capex, unless you believe that that's going to be more, those multipliers are really going to be much higher, I think from a macroeconomic perspective, there's still going to be a drag on growth.
Okay.
So that's where the challenge, that's for the budget to solve this problem is not very realistic. That budget can solve a growth problem. At the same time, you want to keep macroeconomic stability, you want to consolidate. I think so I think a lot of things have to go in the direction of what Pinaki was saying, longer term structural reform, factor market reforms.
That's right. Let me turn to Pinaki. You made two very interesting points on tax. You said that there's not much scope for creating impulses and impetus in the economy apart from tax giveaways. And you also believed that the other schemes probably suggested it, I'm just maybe putting words in your mouth, that cash transfer is something that people talked about. Many state governments are doing it. So cash transfer, welfareism, as opposed to tax giveaway, how do you see this trade-off? Is that a trade-off? In a sense, instead of, let us say, if the government had decided that 1 lakh crore I have got, now instead of making the exemption level to 12 lakh annually, 12.75 lakh for salaried class, which is most probably 6 times the per capita income of the country, which affects a very tiny proportion of India's population of maybe around 40 million people in a country of 1.4 billion. And that on the one hand, on the other hand, is a welfare scheme which is linked to your income level. If you are really poor, if you don't have enough money, if you are a woman who want to go out in the field and work, give them the benefits. So which would have been better, tax giveaways or this kind of welfare scheme aimed at specific classes? As you are a macroeconomist and fiscal expert, so please enlighten us on this.
What I thought these are connected, but yet I think it has to be, when you look at it, I think we have to look at it separately. Why do I say that? Because if we are saying, the number of people who pay income tax is very small, and any benefit to them would mean, distribution is compromised seriously. I think the option for the government, if they really want to give a tax-induced fiscal expansion to those who pay taxes, only instrument now available is the income tax.
Okay.
Because GST is in the GST Council, and this has got to do with the voting, etc. So if you want to reduce GST rate, it is just not possible for the union government. It's not possible for the individual state government. So the instrument that you have is only the income tax. I'm not talking about the corporate sector. I'm talking about personal income tax. Second, if we are really talking about giving expenditure stimulus to the middle class, that would have become even more problematic for the government to politically sell it, because why would then you give expenditure stimulus to the middle class? You give it to the tail end of the distribution of income rather than giving it to the middle class. So the instrument that is there is only the income tax. Secondly,
But you are saying it is a flawed instrument then?
no, I'm not saying it is a flawed instrument. What I'm saying is that this has happened earlier also, because we have reduced the peak rate of income tax to 30%, which is one of the lowest in the world, even among the emerging economies, and that remained stable for 25-30 years. It happened in 97, and then today we are in 2025. And after that, the income tax exemption limit has been increased, but today there has been a significant increase. So that's the difference. So it was thought that this is required, and that was given. Now, in this context, I would also like to highlight the issue that the 8th Pay Commission has already been constituted. So when its recommendation comes into force, I think the overall increase in the mean salary would also be there. So the kind of revenue loss that we are talking about is not going to be that much. That is the first point. Secondly, I don't think there is any instrument available in the hands of the government if they want to give some relief to the middle class, anything other than tax. So it has to be through the taxes side, and that's going to be there as we move forward with an 8-9% growth rate. I think that limit will only increase.
Okay.
There will be no reversal.
Okay. Can I turn to you? Do you have a view on what Pinaki just now said? And in addition, can you just tell this audience what could the government have done on GST? I mean, in a sense, I know budget is not supposed to look at GST, but there have been occasions in the past that the finance minister has used the budget to indicate what the government's central stance on GST would be. So was GST a kind of a lost opportunity, and that you could have said that this is what I will do for my cess, this is what I will do for various things? So both the issues, if you could look at it briefly.
I think, AKB, not, responding to Pinaki in particular, but I think more generally, I want to make the point that, look, from a macroeconomic perspective, whether the budget is growth enhancing or not, there's only one indicator, which is the overall fiscal stance.
Okay.
If your fiscal is consolidating, from a macroeconomic perspective, it's a drag on growth. You can make the argument that, income tax relief or expenditure, cash in the hands of people are going to affect, are going to be growth promoting for certain sectors of the population, certain sections of the population. But from a macroeconomic, if you ask any macroeconomist, that fiscal is consolidating means, aggregate demand is shifting in and growth is going to fall, and so is inflation. So if for the macroeconomy, if you want, growth is slowing, if you want to promote growth, you use other tools. You use monetary policy, which, interest rates have been cut. You use, structural reforms. But, from the budget, this question being asked that, whether budget is growth promoting or not, I think from an aggregate perspective, to the extent that you are consolidating, it's it's going to be a drag on growth, from at least from a cyclical perspective. In this, we should keep in mind. I mean, I think so the fiscal impulse in the budget is negative, and for good reasons, because macroeconomic stability is paramount. So the growth, I think growth has been slowing, and this has been top of mind of policymakers, and there are several other instruments to promote aggregate growth. But of course, there are elements in the budget where, you are promoting, which are more growth propelling for certain sections of the population. Number one. Number two, on GST, I think, to me, I'm looking at it carefully myself. I think simplification of GST, I think different rates was something I think which is on the cards. It may not be in the budget, but I think there, how we can do it in a revenue neutral way is something I think I'm really looking forward to.
Okay, thank you. I think, we started 10 minutes late, so we have about 12 minutes. I will come to the audience here. So please prepare your questions. We can ask, and if you have anything. But before I come to you, I want to ask this one brief question to each of you, which is there anything that you felt this budget should have said but did not say? Who do I start with, Prachi or Pinaki? Prachi. I mean, if you were the finance minister, you would have done that.
Assume if I had no constraints, I think one thing, I think subsidy reform, I think is,
Okay.
is long overdue. I think there was some attempt, but we've seen a bit of backtracking because of the way, in fact, if you look at fertilizer subsidies, we actually regulated, fertilizers which were out of regulations, which were deregulated, non-urea fertilizers. Due to the depreciation in the rupee, we actually went back on regulating some of these non-urea fertilizers. So I think fertilizer subsidy reform is definitely, subsidy reform more generally, I would have expected from a reform perspective.
Okay,
I think.
good.
And the second is, I think, more importantly than what is there in the budget, I would like to see execution of some of the planned capital expenditures, some of the support to vulnerable parts of the population.
Yeah, you mentioned execution in your. Yeah, Pinaki.
Well, I would have liked this interest-free loan to states to stop.
Why? Because of Section 293?
No, I think Section 293 should be there because macro stability is a central function, so center should have control over states' borrowing.
Okay.
That's a very important provision in the Constitution. I think that is.
Yeah, those of you, Article 293 actually imposes restrictions on states. Any state which borrows has to get the clearance from the center before it can borrow. So am I right?
Yes.
Article 293?
Yes.
Yeah.
293(3) is very important provision in the Constitution, and center's control over states' borrowing is very important from macro stability point of view. I'm not getting into that issue,
Sure.
this conspiracy theory of center
Sure.
don't have control. No. so the point here is, when center has large revenue deficit, center borrowing from the market at 7-8% and then giving loans to the states interest-free for 50 years, that means it is a grant. It's not a loan. So that is also having an impact on the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit of the center, because center has to pay the interest. And it is not impacting center fiscal deficit because it appears on the asset and the liability side. So this innovative way of giving grants to the states should stop, because it was there during COVID. It was a crisis period. I think one part of fiscal consolidation should be discontinuation of this.
Why are you opposed to it?
I am opposed to it because if it has to be given, it should be linked to reduction in revenue deficit. If you look at states' revenue deficit, it's increasing.
That's right.
So in other words, states maybe, one has to do a detailed analysis, I won't say understanding, my hunch is in some states, capital expenditure through an interest-free loan has been substituted. States have not actually really spent their own money in capital expenditure. So if really we want to continue this capital expenditure, push through a loan, interest-free loan to the states, I think in the long run it is not sustainable. It should be priced first.
Okay.
I don't want center to give loan and then charge it. So let the states go to the market, give additional borrowing power linked to revenue deficit reduction. I think that would reduce center's revenue deficit. States also would be forced to reduce their revenue deficit and increase capital expenditure. That I think is a feasible thing to do. I think that kind of a reform would help augment capital expenditure at the state level.
Okay. Thank you.
Could I quickly jump in?
Sure, please.
But my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there's not much take up of that interest-free loan. It's very is my understanding. And the whole idea, I think the effective capital expenditure of the central government, which includes public capex by the center and the grants it gives to the states, States are not using that,
Well,
the
it is
grants.
rising,
Yeah.
it began with 13,000 crore, then the next year it went up to 75,000 crore, and then now it is for 2 successive years, 1.5 lakh crore is rising. But you are right, the offtake is less. Yeah.
Based on the
Finance commission revenue formula. That's also true. That's also true. So, I mean, let's throw it open for discussion from the floor. Please, if you have any questions, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, identify yourself and ask the
Thank you,
question.
Bipul Chatterjee from Cuts International. I have a feeling, correct me if I'm wrong, that this projected growth rate for the next fiscal, 6.3 to 6.8%, it's on a higher side. I think we'll do very well if we can achieve 6%, given the fiscal consolidation and all other things which you have spoken about. So, am I right? Am I wrong? And given all the developments which are taking place, good or bad, at the global level, even 6% would be a tough call. So that's my question to both Pinaki and Prachi.
Just to correct, the budget, projects nominal growth of 10.1%. So so get it in the right context. So please, Prachi, you want
I'm
to
talking
take it?
about real growth.
Yeah, but real growth budget does not give,
Economic survey.
economic survey. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not in the business of forecasting growth, but I think it's, my guess would be somewhere between 6 and 6.5%, I think, for the given year. But you're absolutely right. I think if you have fiscal consolidation, if you've had, regulation, there have been regulatory measures on consumer lending, etc., which slowed consumption as well. Monetary policy so far, I mean, there has been a recent cut, has been over the last few years. I think monetary policy tightened by at least 200 basis points, and this works with lags. So 250 basis points, and it works with lags. So I think so. Growth slowing we should not be that surprised, because from a cyclical perspective, I think, given tight fiscal policy, tight monetary policy, and regulatory measures, so some of the slowdown is expected, and that will build into growth going forward. My guess would be somewhere between 6.5%.
The real growth, 6.5. Okay, Pinaki, your take.
I don't know, to be very frank. From the budget number, the nominal growth that has been there, it's to 10.1. So, and if we assume that we are going to grow at 6%, we are talking about 4% inflation. I don't think we are anywhere near 4% inflation. So our nominal growth rate may be around 11-12%. That in itself would show a better fiscal number.
But just to sort of do a reality check, current year's nominal growth has turned out to be 9.7. Current year, nominal growth is 9.7. The budget had projected 10.5.
10.5, yes.
So, and in spite of that, we have seen the kind of growth that we have seen in the revenue. So there's something revenue buoyancy. So what would you say to that?
No, revenue buoyancy is certainly there, particularly GST and personal income taxes. I think significant growth we have seen post-COVID. So it's a revenue-led consolidation, and expenditure has remained stagnant as a percentage of GDP. I think that is the broad trend after COVID. I think that would continue in 2025, 26. But in terms of growth, it's not only India. I think there are headwinds that the budget speech also mentioned about, and it's very difficult to project a particular number. I would not do that.
Okay. Any questions from this side? Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Inderpal Singh. I'm a LAMP fellow. I work with Mr. Gaurav Gugui. My question is about the new tax bill. I would love to hear your insights. Anybody can answer on what are the expectations from the new tax bill? How does it fit into the vision of the new the budget? I mean, of course, there's talk about how it unifies the taxation system, it simplifies, but what are the other expectations and how does it fit into the context of the budget?
So your question is on the tax rates or the new tax law which is coming?
The new tax law which is coming.
Okay, that would be speculating it. So if you have any information. Well, the information that we have is that it will be simplification. It will be, taking some of the provisions in the budget itself, like in transfer pricing, giving extension to some of the clauses for a longer period of time. So taking what the government believes, Vivad se Vishwas tak, which is from disputes to trust. So that will be the broad spirit, and a huge reduction in the number of provisions in the law. Remember, this is a very, very old piece of legislation. So I guess, and this is based on what we understand from government circles, that it will be a simplification and making things easier for a person to understand what the law is all about. Yeah. Yeah. If there are any other questions, yeah, please.
Sincere greetings, Excellencies. My question is specifically to defense budget. It is rose by 9.5%, but as we can see, it is only just 1.9% of GDP. As far as sixth generation of jets in China is concerned, and indigenous defense technology, which is under Atmanirbhar Bharat, and also the emerging tension in Indo-Pacific region is concerned, is this number allowing us to keep up the pace with other defense related countries, or we can say the neighbors of a country, specifically China?
Any thoughts?
Well, I think I'll try.
Yeah.
Not that I know much about defense expenditure and what is its optimal level. I think when we talk about capital expenditure, what is the two major capital expenditures of the central government? It's the defense expenditure and the expenditure on railways. And if we look at as a percentage of GDP, it's around 1.9. So it's stagnant at around 2% of GDP for the last, it's almost a decade now. I remember, doing some assessment exercise for centers resources, and there also the norm was 2% of GDP. So that's the kind of norm that was there. Whether that is optimal or not, I have no idea. But it remained at that level. It hasn't increased. But you also have to take into consideration the fact that GDP also has grown in nominal term at more than 11% in the last, except the COVID years. So defense expenditure has grown at 11, 12% of GDP. Now, what it is in terms of, other countries, threat perceptions, etc., is a very specialized debate. I do not know about it. I just wanted to give you this broad understanding of what is defense expenditure. In that context, I also wanted to highlight this lot of discussion about center doing capex. Center really cannot do much capex.
I'll come to that.
So center's capex is limited to defense and revenue. The capex loan to the state is pushing up capital expenditure. So if capex loan is stopped, center's capex will not be very significant, and center need not do capex. So it's not the center has to do capex, because many things have gone into PPP mode. Many infrastructures have been built through SL financing mechanism. So that way, the continuous increase in capex is not a feasible option either. But in the case of states, that's not the case, because the quality of capex at the state level, the nature of capex at the state level is very different. So that discussion is a very different. What is the nature of capital expenditure that we are talking about? We are actually talking about apple and oranges. Capex is not a homogeneous commodity, capex in union, capex in state have different meaning altogether. So when we talk about capex, we really have to take a very nuanced view of capex. We just cannot take an aggregate number and say that capex has
That's
increased.
right. Yeah. Prachi, you want to add? Please.
Yeah, I think, the problem is, the dilemma is that states are not able to spend. So if you take into account what Pinaki is saying, and no matter how much the center allocates, unless the states are able to spend, I think, I think it's a big issue, especially for growth, because, growth is slowing and we want to push growth.
Yeah, sure. Just to respond to that question of yours is a very important question. And I think given our defense challenges around, probably we could do with a few basis points higher expenditure on defense. But there's something called the absorptive capacity of the system. And I think what we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, the post-COVID years, has seen the government centers, what Pinaki said, Center's capex has risen at a CAGR of around 25% every year. Now, it's never happened. Now, the government system is also, in my view, a little choked. It cannot spend everything that is allocated. This year, it has slowed down. It is said that because of elections, but I think it's much more than that. The railway budget, the capex is the same because the system cannot take, 2.5 lakh crore is the capex. It cannot take on anything more. So there is a, limited capacity of the system to take it unless there are other ways of expanding the scope. So I would say that. So if there are no other questions from the floor, I would just like to ask Prachi and Pinaki, any concluding comments, brief statements you want to make, and then we close the session.
Yeah, I think thank you very much, EKB. It's very engaging, and thank you to the audience. I would just say, I think to me, as I said in my concluding, I think the budget is pragmatic. Ultimately, I think execute. I think to me, that is the way forward.
So execution is the mantra.
Execution.
Pinaki, what will be your mantra?
No, I think budget has taken into consideration the macroeconomic headwinds we have and tried to boost consumption, push more capital expenditure through interest-free loans to the states, and also try to boost sentiments. I think that also budget talks about. I think going forward for growth, I would say there was a sectoral fiscal expansion and there was sectoral fiscal contraction also for overall fiscal consolidation.
So on the whole, it's a balanced budget. Will that be a fair assessment?
I think so.
Okay, and execution being the key. With these words, thank you very much to my co-speakers, Prachi and Pinaki, and thank you everybody here for being so participative. Thank you once again.